Hello, and thanks for joining me today. We'll be discussing the importance of becoming trauma informed and how it builds resilience in youth and strengthens families. I'd like to begin by asking you to take a moment to complete the Adverse Childhood Experiences questionnaire. When answering the questions, only answer yes if the experience occurred prior to turning 18, and then once you've finished, add up any yes responses. This isn't a test and you don't have to share your answers. You can go ahead and pause the presentation while you complete the survey. So, what are adverse childhood experiences? From 1995 to 1997, Kaiser Permanente of San Diego conducted a study. They were examining a wide range of traumatic childhood experiences and their relation to the physical, mental, and emotional well-being of adults throughout their lifespan. Adverse experiences had to have occurred between birth and 18 years of age, and they included physical, emotional, and/or sexual abuse, neglect, and a variety of household dysfunctions including domestic violence, the incarceration of a parent's mental health and/or substance abuse issues, as well as whether there was a separation or divorce between parents. Now, what they found in the study of over 17,000 participants was that 64% had at least one ACE and 12% had four or more ACEs. But more importantly, they discovered a biological gradient like you see here on the screen, or what is called a dose relationship between adverse childhood experiences and chronic disease, poor physical and mental health, weight issues, substance abuse, all indicating that the higher the ACE score, the more likely they would be to have not only a possible risk of one, but multiple negative outcomes later in life. Meaning that not only was an individual with four ACEs at higher risk of poor physical and mental health with things like blood pressure, diabetes, anxiety, and depression, but that these illnesses would likely overlap with other issues such as cancer, heart disease, and even premature death. So now take that information and think about it for a minute in consideration of your own personal ACE score. So why? Why does this information matter? I mean, it seems pretty obvious, and the common misconception is that choices play into those poor health outcomes later in life, right? Which, of course, in part they do. But take, for example, if you're a smoker, you know you're increasing your risk of getting lung cancer. But what we're learning is that for someone who smokes and has a high ACE score, they are 2 to 3.5 times more likely to develop lung cancer than a person with zero ACEs. So I ask the question again, why? Why does this happen and how? What research is showing is that our inherent stress response system and whether it is calibrated or dysregulated is the link between adverse childhood experiences and poor physical, mental, and emotional health. The stress response system is commonly referred to as the fight, flight, or freeze response, and it is connected to the central nervous system. It's the way that our brain tells our body how to respond to stressors and threats of danger. In a calibrated stress response system, the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that sits just behind your forehead, perceives the threat, notifies the brain's limbic system, and initiates a stress response. There are three types of stressors that activate the stress response system. There's positive stress, which is a natural and normal part of development with brief increases in heart rate and hormone levels. There's tolerable stress, which has longer lasting difficulties based on the severity of the stress, but because the activation is time limited, eventually the child and stress response system are able to adapt. And then there's toxic stress. Toxic stress occurs when frequently prolonged and intensely negative experiences, such as ACEs, disrupt the calibration of the stress response system, which results in dysregulation. So here we're going to take a closer look at the difference between a calibrated and dysregulated stress response system. With positive stress, like giving a presentation or a child beginning a new school or daycare, the physiological response is going to be brief with elevated changes in heart rate, blood pressure, and hormone levels. But they're all going to be able to return to normal, or what we call a state of homeostasis, where the body and emotions and behavior are balanced and regulated. In the case of tolerable stress, which is brought on by a more serious stressor, such as a car accident or an earthquake, the stress response lasts longer, causing temporary changes in the calibration of the system. So there's still a rise of heart rate and blood pressure, and there's a release of stress hormones, including cortisol, and they're all elevated for a longer period. But with the right support, eventually the response system is able to return to homeostasis without causing any further damage to the stress response system. Where it differs with toxic stress, which we discussed comes from intense negative and sustained abuse or neglect or any of the household dysfunction that we discussed, the overstimulation results in a constant physiological state of fight, flight, or freeze. It's causing the dysregulation of the stress response system, meaning that it's preventing it from returning back to homeostasis. And during this time, an overabundance of stress hormones are being released and wreaking havoc on the brain and the body. Let's put this all together with a visual illustration. Start by putting your hand up to participate. Your brainstem is represented by the base of your hand at the wrist. This is where your brain tells your body to breathe and pump your heart. Now fold your thumb inward. This represents the limbic system of your brain, or the reactionary part. It includes your amygdala, which is associated with emotions, fight, flight response, pleasure, reward, and pain. It also includes your hippocampus, which helps with memory of past experiences. Now, you're going to fold your fingers over the front of your thumb. This is your prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive functions such as your working memory, self-monitoring and self-control, adaptable thinking, planning, organization, and even time management. When our prefrontal cortex detects stress, the amygdala located in the limbic system activates the stress response of hyperarousal, and our prefrontal cortex is overwhelmed. Once the stress or the perceived threat is relieved, the prefrontal cortex is able to return to its natural state of functioning. This is a calibrated stress response system. But a dysregulated stress response system is in a constant state of arousal, and stress hormones are flooding the body, and the prefrontal cortex doesn't have the time it needs to rest and reflect and build your executive functions. So now that we understand what ACEs are and how the stress response system works, we're going to explore a quick overview of attachment theory. As human beings, we have an innate desire to connect. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth began researching the connection between a parent and child in relation to a child's future development and building healthy relationships through an experiment called the Strange Situation. During this experiment, they found that there are 4 types of attachment built on the responsiveness and presence of a caretaker's parenting style. The first is a secure attachment. A secure attachment is formed when a caretaker is responsive and predictable, timely and sensitive in an effective manner. This results in individuals who are trusting and able to cope in times of stress. They have better emotional regulation and high self-esteem, as well as academic success, and happier and more positive relationships later in life. The next 3 are an insecure attachment. The second is avoidant attachment, which often results when a caretaker is insensitive or indifferent to a child's emotional needs, yet meeting the child's physical needs during the first year of life. As an individual with avoidant attachment, they're often insensitive to nonverbal signals and they're focused on the physical world. They can also be dismissive of intimate relationships. The third is the ambivalent or anxious resistant attachment, and this occurs with parental inconsistency of meeting a child's needs. This causes anxiety for a child as to whether they can trust the caretaker, and it causes inner confusion. This child is likely to be insecure and anxious as well as stressed. The fourth and final insecure attachment is disorganized attachment. Unfortunately, this happens when the caretaker is also the threat to the child's physical and emotional safety. The child's behavior is fragmented and disorganized because the mixed signals in the brain are fragmented and disorganized as to whether or not the caretaker is safe or a threat. Remember the hand-brain model we just did. This results in difficulty regulating emotions and feeling safe, which can result in dissociation, severe behavioral and emotional dysregulation as well. This leads us to the part of our discussion of some of the consequences. ACEs not only cause a disruption to the prefrontal cortex, metabolic system, and sympathetic nervous system, but they also have a tendency to influence gene expression. For children, all of this is taking place during critical sensitive periods of development, which increase a child's vulnerability to biological, mental, and behavioral adverse outcomes, like some of these traumatic spectrum disorders listed here. This list is in no way exhaustive, and it's important to note that often a child is going to not only suffer from one, but two or more of these disorders overlapping, which is known as comorbidity. Today, we're going to look at just a few of the trauma and stressor related disorders, but if you look at this list, you'll see a lot of common names that you may already be familiar with, such as anxiety, depression, substance abuse. There's post-traumatic stress disorder, which we'll discuss a little more today. But then there may be some that you don't know too much about, like borderline personality disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder, adjustment disorders. But when our stress regulation system is disrupted, it's also disrupting the way that our genes are expressed. So it really is very complex, the amount of detail that goes into whether or not any of these disorders comes to fruition for any individual. Stressors that take place in the school and in the family life or environment can be any number of things, from a parent losing their job or a child witnessing violence. But that stress for children, that struggle to cope and self-regulate, can easily become distress, often resulting in an adjustment disorder. Frequently, symptoms of an adjustment disorder in children begin with complaints of a headache or stomach aches accompanied by feelings of being upset, and they generally begin within 3 months of the stressor, and they shouldn't last longer than 6 months. But it's important to be aware and recognize these symptoms for intervention, because they can lead to another more serious disorder down the road if not addressed. Remember that attachment theory is based on the connection formed between a child and their caretaker, and that it sets the precedent for future social interactions and secure relationships. Attachment disorders are the result of insecure attachments that are formed due to the conditions of emotional and physical abuse and neglect. Both reactive attachment disorder, RAD, and disinhibited social engagement disorder, DSED, can be diagnosed as early as 9 months old in children. Reactive attachment disorder is less common and diagnosed in only about 10% of children that are maltreated, and found in about 4% of children that are institutionalized in, say, a group home. Some exhibited symptoms are that the child is withdrawn and doesn't seek comfort or respond to comfort during times of distress. The child often shows signs of being fearful, irritable, and/or sad. These symptoms must present prior to the age of 5. More prevalent is the disinhibited social engagement disorder, found to affect around 20% of maltreated children and 17% of institutionalized children. But unlike children with RAD that pull away, children with DSED have no boundaries or fear of strangers, and they appear comfortable in unfamiliar settings. They seem to have no need to check in with whoever is the caretaking adult at the time. These symptoms must be evident for a minimum of 12 months, and ADHD has to already be ruled out. As advocates, awareness of comorbidity is essential in understanding that each individual case has to be carefully assessed, and communication between clinicians and social workers and even foster parents is crucial to the success of a child's treatment. The most troubling and most misunderstood trauma stress related disorder is post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD, which is commonly misconceived as only affecting war veterans or to be an immediate response to trauma. Most concerning is the thought that people think that people can control their response to trauma, and therefore they can control whether or not they experience PTSD. But these are all false misconceptions. At this point of the presentation, we're all aware of the complexity that the environment and stressors have on children in their development. So it shouldn't be surprising that PTSD is equally complex and can be influenced by neurological, biological, and genetic factors that result in a variety of symptoms. It's also been suggested that there could be a distinction between those who experience a single major traumatic event, like a natural disaster, considered to be a type 1 trauma, which presents with more avoidance, hyperarousal, and re experiencing symptoms. Whereas with a type 2 trauma, that would result from repeated and sustained abuse, showing signals of denial, numbing, dissociation, and rage. It's important to note that even still, when children have been sexually abused, they may exhibit inappropriate sexual behavior and more re experiencing. Here's some other common examples of symptoms in children and adolescents with PTSD. They may show signs of hostility, a change of personality, or social withdrawal. They may have impaired social relationships or exhibit impulsive and disruptive behavior. They may be feeling disconnected from reality. Children may have a hard time regulating their emotions and have complaints of digestive problems or dizziness or headaches, as well as being on guard and feeling threatened while exhibiting their feelings of despair and shame and hopelessness. There are a myriad of ways that a child may respond to trauma. It's not limited to just this list, but there is a standard criteria that has to be met for children 6 years and older to receive an official diagnosis of PTSD. And it does differ for preschool children, given that the characteristics of their development period are also different. Some warning signs that accompany PTSD are: one, PTSD is brought on by a trigger or a stressor in the environment, and it can be anything from a smell to even a season of the year. But children don't know what they don't know, so they may not be able to articulate why or what caused them to feel or behave differently. It's important to start examining the environment around them and what's happening so that they're able to identify those triggers and try to avoid them in the future. Two, there are high rates of comorbidity with other diagnoses, putting youth at risk for internal disorders like depression and anxiety, as well as external risks of substance abuse. And three, parents and caretakers' response can have a positive or a negative influence on a child's response, so it's important to proceed with care. Being withdrawn or unresponsive, or even being overprotective, can result in exacerbating symptoms for a child with PTSD. And then four, everyone responds differently to trauma. And by minimizing the impact or reaction to a child's trauma, PTSD can go unaddressed and undiagnosed, which would lead to immediate as well as long term psychological consequences. It's not possible to truly discuss the depth of physical, emotional, and psychological issues that are associated with ACEs and trauma, but before we move on, I wanted to highlight the common symptom of irritability in children. This symptom overlaps oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, depressive disorders, which are not confined to a single diagnosis but grouped into several subtypes such as major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, acute stress, and PTSD. And with each of these, let's not forget the high risk threat of suicide among anybody with a mood disorder or substance abuse and behavioral issues. So it's important that if you notice a child is irritable beyond what is normal for their age and development, it's a sign that something is wrong. So what? What now? All of this intense negative trauma and outcomes, what are we supposed to do? Or what even can we do? We are going to celebrate because California Surgeon General Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, who's been championing ACEs awareness, says that ACEs are not destiny. There is hope and healing is possible, and it begins with you. Just the simple act of participating in this presentation today, you've already taken the first step in helping to build a child's resiliency by becoming trauma informed. It requires a shift in thinking from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. A recent study focused on positive relationships, caretaker competencies, and achievements, which they defined as positive childhood experience, and examined their role in the adult remission of 4 different personality disorders. The study found that there was a significant relationship in positive childhood experiences and the remission of 3 of the 4 disorders, even when accounting for abuse. This suggests that the way a child's brain gets wired or rewired is influenced and determined by our relational interactions. When a child is feeling supported, safe, and secure, he or she can move from maladaptive to adaptive mood regulation strategies. Positive childhood experiences begin with having a trauma informed buffer. We have repeatedly discussed our innate desire to connect through attachment theory. We're created to be in community with one another. Connection and relationship offer a sense of belonging, and it begins with being present and consistent, helping to reduce stress and strengthen life skills. It lets a child know that they are seen. Some examples of buffering are teaching the practice of positive self talk, celebrating and encouraging a child's individual strengths. And once trust is established, or if you already have a child's trust, hug, even if for no reason other than to just let them know that you are safe and that you care. Because hugs release oxytocin, and oxytocin is called the cuddle hormone. It inhibits and counteracts the stress response system's release of stress hormones, relaxing the prefrontal cortex, and it also has antidepressant effects. Successful treatment serves as a protective factor. That's why, as an advocate, being aware of overlapping symptoms and diagnoses is so important. But being aware is only the beginning. Communication and working with clinicians, pediatricians, the child's school, a social worker, and the foster or adoptive family will help ensure the process of differential diagnosis through observation and assessment. And this leads to options of evidence based forms of treatment like parent child interaction therapy, trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and trauma informed parenting classes. This can be overwhelming for anyone. But there are resources available, and here I left some examples. For ACEs awareness, you can visit the ACEs awareness website. Also, Dr. Nadine Burke Harris has an informational TED Talk as well as a book called The Deepest Well. I included some links to websites that go further into detail on supporting parents and caregivers of children who have experienced trauma, as well as another book recommendation, The Power of Showing Up by Dr. Daniel Siegel and Dr. Tina Payne Bryson. Finally, there are links to information on different evidence-based treatments for the child and the family. If you're not sure where to start, begin by visiting the Child Mind Institute link at the top. Thank you for joining me today. It is my sincere hope that you walk away feeling more informed and empowered in taking the necessary steps to building a stronger, more resilient community of youth, ensuring a better, healthier future for them and for our world.